Agenda item 8.4, this is the first reading of 3 proposed policy changes. I believe it was 3. We will not be voting to approve the policy changes tonight. Policy changes require 2 readings. The first will be today, and then we would vote on the policy changes at our next regular meeting on February 11th. Mr. Murphy.
Thank you. On behalf of Mr. Kevin Sutton and Bob Schindler, who met with our Policy and Curriculum Subcommittee on January 9th to discuss this topic, present their recommendations, and answer questions. I bring to you a first reading tonight of a couple of targeted policy changes. I don't intend to read them to you, but I would like to read for the community and for the record the intro, sort of the background as to why these are being brought in this manner at this time. The Michigan legislature enacted a number of new laws which impact district operations, particularly in the area of personnel. As these new changes in law take effect on February 13th, 2024, we are recommending that the board act now to adjust certain personnel-related policies to properly prepare and position the district for the new statutory reality. Herein, we outline proposed changes to RCS Policy 3300. The board is requested to review and act on these proposed changes by February 13, 2024. We also are providing notice to the board of 6 new or revised administrative regulations that we have recommended for inclusion in the district's administrative regulation manual. Like the proposed policy changes, these new revised administrative regulations are intended to ensure the district is in compliance with the changing legal landscape. Under existing board policy, administrative regulations take effect 30 days after they are presented to the board. As the board is aware, the SPCC has been actively engaged in reviewing all policies in their entirety with the intent of bringing a myriad of updates to the board for review and discussion. While that process is drawing closer to its conclusion, the time-sensitive nature of the proposed revisions contemplated herein require board action now on this narrow set of items. So as was provided publicly and to the board, there are, I believe, 2 recommended policy adjustments or edits in the 3300 area. One on, and they're in purple in your packet if you have the color-coded one. One on staffing, layoff, and recall of teachers. And the other on performance evaluations, teacher evaluations. And both in the document provided is the current RCS policy and the recommended updated policy. I want to note that typically we would not be bringing administrative regulations in conjunction with policy recommendation changes. However, with the time-sensitive nature here, and just because I can, only imagine that being provided only the policy change would provide a lot of questions in your head, the SPCC, in combination with these 2 attorneys that we're working with, thought it a good idea to have you be able to see, if you were to adopt these policy changes, how those would look. Also, it starts that 30-day window where they could, in theory, if approved, take effect in conjunction with one another at the next regularly scheduled February board meeting, which would be ahead of that date of the law taking effect. The time-sensitive nature was precipitated a bit by the early conclusion of the legislative session, which frankly made this effective date probably about a month or so before most of us were predicting that they would take effect. So with that, again, I don't intend necessarily to read the policies to you that you've had for a week or so. And I won't pretend to be able to answer every possible question, but I'm willing to either answer what I can and or note or get help from others here on other answers, or note and follow through on other questions to the authors of this memo. I wasn't provided any questions ahead of this meeting, so again, just ahead of time, I may not be prepared to answer depending on what you ask. Yep.
Trustee Blake.
So I was at the meeting, the SBCC meeting, where we approved these, and what we learned through our legal counsel, we learned some things at that meeting. And I think we were all in agreement that this was fine. A community member has raised a concern before the meeting that I didn't have an answer for, and I think this is the right one, the 4003.4 AR about program reductions, where it says the superintendent has the sole authority to determine and conduct program reduction. I think that's the right section. And I guess my question is, I never understood that we were intending to transfer authority from board members over to the administration, and so I'm questioning if that is part of the intention. And we do have another month on this, so I'll follow up with the attorney on that to find out more.
Yeah,
But if
no,
you
I
have
would-
whatever you have.
And I
you know.
haven't done a comparison on that particular one to the old, hearing the same comments you heard this evening. I'll note that the intro to that section, which wouldn't be a part of the ARs, but is sort of a note to the board, says, "This administrative regulation governs program reductions and is intended to comply with the revisions to section 1248 of the revised school code." So again, in theory, all of these are meant to, and written carefully, to comply with the school code. But again, to that particular question, I haven't had a chance to go back.
And we're not passing this tonight anyhow, so I'll follow up with legal counsel on that, but I just wanted to raise that issue.
Yep.
Because that was not our intention at the meeting.
Trustee Weaver?
So I'm a little confused and slightly concerned that something was approved in a committee, but then there's questions. So that specific section
There's
is,
nothing approved at the committee.
okay, I'm just going by the words I heard, so, okay, better to know something was approved, but that this was, something happened with this document, but now there's questions of what's in it, so this is the concerns I've had with the committee and it being completely behind closed doors, but so.
Can I clarify that a little bit before you ask your question?
Sure.
So the committee was able to ask any questions ahead of this document. This was a discussion. The committee, and I think this was the intent all along, but the subcommittee also recommended as soon as possible that the entirety be provided in a memo form to the entire board so you'd have time to review it. I think the idea of approval essentially was that, yeah, all of us there, or the three of you there, agreed that that was the appropriate next
Right,
step.
but I'm saying, just in the comment we just heard, it sounds like there wasn't clear that this part of transferring power from the board to the superintendent, when it's clear in the recommendation for the policy update, which is the policy part, the last part of it, subject to limitations set forth within through policy or regulation, the superintendent has the sole authority to determine teacher placement, the existence of a teacher vacancy, or to implement a personnel or program reduction. It states that right in the policy. That is a clear transfer of the board's authority to the superintendent. So I would like to, understand what drove anyone to put that in there, and how would it be appropriate to allow anyone to have sole authority over something like that? No industry, again, would give sole authority to someone to do massive things of that nature. There's checks and balances at every level. So I would like to understand how the committee ever would have thought that statement should be in this policy.
The statement, in, just so I'm clear, so I asked the question correctly, the statement in its entirety or strictly related to the concern brought up earlier about the reduction of programs?
Specifically, the superintendent has sole authority. Anything after that sentence, but that it's in a policy. Policy is the purview of the board, that we are granting in a policy sole authority to the superintendent. That means we no longer have oversight. So I would like to understand how that isn't putting us in compliance with any law. What problem was that solving? What was the why to add that to this? Because that does not fit in any way. And as we heard from the member of our community earlier, it actually doesn't align with actual law. So I'm just trying to understand how
Yeah, that
anywhere, and
part-
I do think, and I'll be very transparent, I assume Miller Johnson put this in here and just is trying to hope it slides by. But that's why, again, I'm glad we're having this conversation, but that whole sentence, or that whole section, seems to be completely irrelevant and should be completely stripped out of this.
Well, I definitely cannot speak to the legality of the school code, having not reviewed it in the last, hour since the statement was made. However, it should be noted that throughout policy and administrative regulations, oftentimes the power is given to the superintendent. The intent all the way through is that the superintendent delegates many of these powers. As far as teacher placement, that is putting into place what happens now. Districts currently have sole right of placement of teachers into the, positions that they're in. The way that that's delegated is read by the superintendent. Obviously, the superintendent doesn't personally do all that. They are the one that the board directs. The superintendent then has a team, an HR department, curriculum department, that then implements whatever that policy is. So again, that's not really a specific answer to your question, although, again, the language is frequent throughout any policy or AR manual that the superintendent is given this power, meant to mean they're the ones sort of that you direct. They then have a team that actually implements any policy change. But I understand the sort of the gist of the question as it relates to the initial, and it's similar to what Mr. Blake, so I think we can get that clarified for
Well,
certain.
again, I was just pointing, because he was reporting to the AR, this is with a policy which grants the AR the ability to do what it says it can do. 100% I agree with what you're saying. The idea that we have the structure in place, because really, the superintendent shouldn't be the one making those decisions on reduction of program. That would come from the Neil DeLucas, the Corey Hedges, of saying, hey, we got to cut 6 heads, right? We got a budget cut. We get a notice of, hey, we got to reduce 6 heads. The direction would be to those guys, hey, where are we going to come up with the 6 heads, right? Come up with a plan, come up with the
But the superintendent
how.
always has to approve what it is the HR director, the curriculum director, anyone under him, especially when it's a question of that great, right? Like a teacher being reduced, a program being adjusted, something that relates to something that's really going to impact the livelihood of the employees or the education of the children. Of course, those other people will be making the decisions, helping to make them and recommend them. The way policies and administrative regulations read, to my understanding, is that ultimately falls under the responsibility to approve of the superintendent as directed, as appropriate by the school board.
So let me finish, because we're on the same place, but I think we're just missing a step. So 100%, that would be the part where it goes down, whatever the ask is, and again, I'm just throwing out the hypothetical, hey, we got to reduce 6 heads. That would be what has to happen. Yes, the people that work in the area would come up with a plan. This is where we see how we're going to do it. Yes, that would funnel up to ultimately Mr. Silveri in this case, but then it needs to come to the board. The board needs to have the final approval of the plan, because no, the sole authority does not, because that's a budget cut. That drives budget. It's budget overview, so it would be, what would be, hey, we're over budget, because there's a reason we're having to drop the 6 heads for this hypothetical. That's the part where we got to get to, is the plan comes from the people below. Yes, it's roles and responsibilities. Ultimately, it's Mr. Silveri submits the final plan to the board of saying, hey, this is how we're going to achieve cutting the 6 heads. And then the board has to approve it. This right here is saying that doesn't happen. And now we're only, to your point, because it's so vague, it's not, even if you wanted to keep it away from the board, it would have to be very specific that still the sole authority should not rest in one person. It should still be, for manpower moves, should come up through HR. There should be many different steps. So this sentence here is, all it is doing is literally just taking the power away from the board.
We have a meeting in 2 days of the committee that's talking about this. We can bring these questions up. I'm not clear I'm not intending to give more power to the superintendent than what he currently has, but at the same time, the board can't do everything. The superintendent has to do something, so we'll explore this further in our committee meeting.
Yeah, and just
You
to
said everything.
clarify, I was part of that committee too. We spent very little time talking about this. At that time, we actually were not provided these documents, and what they went over with us was a very high-level overview of what was happening. I was not aware of that particular sentence when we were talking about it. So, I mean, we were only there for maybe 15 or 20 minutes talking with the lawyer at that point in time, and then we only got the documents as a full board on Thursday with the board packet, as far as I know. So,
Just to be clear, these, and maybe it helps from the perspective of context a bit, these set of recommendations globally were provided to clients of Miller Johnson
Okay,
for an
sure.
annual update to comply with legal changes.
And-
It's a greater document than what you have here. The reason all of it hasn't been brought to this board in its entirety to update our policy, considering all of their legal recommendations, is because of that other process we're engaged in. So in other words, if there were things within that that we're already talking about that are on our parking lot for Thursday to talk about, for instance, we didn't feel it appropriate to circumvent that process. These are the
Right,
two
these
that
are
are time-specific,
time-sensitive.
and there's
Yep.
nothing written in here that is specific to Rochester Community Schools. These are part of their overall annual update as it applies to something time-specific.
Okay, yeah, but-
That being said, I think ahead of Thursday, I will simply play, this will be recorded, this will be available, so, Kevin can have the whole context of this discussion as we prepare
Yes.
and can address on Thursday.
And we can absolutely have that discussion, and I think that will be very valuable. The other thing I would say to complement this, and when I was looking at this, was when I think about a program reduction, it was making me think, again, the same thing. Shouldn't that actually be brought to the board for approval? Because the board approves curriculum and textbooks based on standards, goals, and policies established by the board. That's what MASB says. So shouldn't board also approve the removal or the reduction of a program? It reminds me of when advanced language arts was taken away, and that was done, sole authority of somebody else rather than a Board of Education decision. So that was something that immediately popped in my head.
Trustee Alsbach?
Mr. Murphy, I have a question kind of a different way. It's my understanding that our qualifications for teachers, the teacher evaluation rubric, the categories are changing. I see language in here that will only be valid until the end of the year. Am I correct? Because I don't see needs support, developing, and effective. I see ineffective in here. So
I think, if I'm understanding it correctly, it speaks to ineffective specifically, but earlier than that, it essentially says we will follow a procedure that follows the law. The law says those 3 categories rather than 4, so there is a sentence there that says we will comply.
Oh,
It
and
just
I-
doesn't name them specifically.
Well, I know we're going to follow the law, of course we are, but my question is, would you update the policies to then, take the word need effect, or ineffective and swap it out for teachers that are considered needing support? Or, because we're going from 3 to 4 categories. So my question is, are you going to change the language, and how are you going to map those differences?
Noted and will be asked. I should know, it reminds me of one other thing. Part of the reason also that we're bringing this today is these are subjects to negotiations now. These topics now, we haven't said that overtly tonight, but we've talked about it a lot in the past. These 2 topics are also subject to upcoming negotiations. So, even if approved in 30 days, there's a likelihood or a possibility that we're coming back to this subject to what gets agreed upon or changed or adjusted in future negotiations related to these topics. The goal with the time-sensitive nature, to reiterate one more time, was to have compliant language in place if negotiations aren't done by July 1st, let's say, and we don't have compliant language, we could be in violation of law changes. So there's some of the, it's why we're here tonight, right? That's why it's being brought to you in this sort of alternative way, a little quicker than normal. But we'll ask that question Thursday too, it's a good point.
So are you saying that based on how negotiations come out, that might impact these administrative regulations and policies?
Correct, because, let's take teacher evaluations as an example. Because teacher evaluations are now subject to bargaining, we have used for the last, I don't know how long, since I've been here, the Charlotte Danielson, which is one of the 5 approved models. That's subject to negotiation now. Perhaps perhaps the teachers union, I don't know this, but wants to go in a different direction, and that becomes part of that agreement. We would then be coming back to make sure our policies and our administrative regulations accurately reflect that, or any other change along the way as well. This sort of sets a baseline for that discussion.
All right, are there any other questions at this point? Okay,